What do you think about that issue? I think Mr. Akabichi talked about it briefly. Those transition issues in the private, in the power sector privatization between the public to the private sector, teething problems about the billings and all those issues. What do you think about it?
Well, there are issues that would have to come up, and there are issues that, like any transition, would have to be addressed, and which are the issues I, quietly referred to earlier when I said there's a process ongoing, and we would have to try and see what can be done to expedite some of this. You see, I think there is now a reality beginning to be apparent that the fact that you move the assets of the erstwhile PHCN into private ownership, there is a learning curve where the new private sector owners understand the nature of the assets that they have acquired, understand the nature of the markets that they are facing, and begin to try and figure ways of dealing with that market effectively and enhancing those assets productively. Now, that is not something with the best will in the world. If my memory is correct, this is probably the largest power privatization program ongoing in the world. And so, if that's correct, it's not something to be digested in one swoop, as the Honorable Commissioner had alluded to, that there are transition issues. And believe me, these transition issues are not minor.
But is it wrong to assume that these new owners should have perhaps done their feasibility study? I mean, in Lagos Business School, I imagine you talk about people getting their business plan before they go in and all those kind of issues. So when consumers like us expect that, yeah, but without that, you guys had this all figured out. So this management problem shouldn't pop up to the extent that we get billed for services not provided and all these kind of challenges.
Well, the process of asset acquisition in any business it's, for me, more complex when it's a transfer from the public to the private sector. Even in private sector transactions where assets are transferred from one owner to the other, there is a learning curve. Even in the private sector circumstances where data rooms are opened and you're allowed to look as closely as you like, when you actually are in full physical control of the assets that you can actually determine the nature, quality, and what it takes to run those assets. And so for all of us who have made the assumptions that now the private sector is in charge, it will immediately change, a couple of things. Question one would be, has the generation capacity or the volumes that we're generating in power actually increased since the private sector took over? Note, I don't think so. So, and remember, the private sector companies have taken over the distribution companies. Yes, they are now in the process of taking over the generation companies. Okay? So there's still a whole transition period ahead of us. Don't press me to put any timelines to that. I'm not a power specialist. I'm a mere economist.
But as a mere consumer, I mean, as a consumer who has an idea of what it usually takes with this transition period, what can you reasonably advise other consumers to expect?
Oh, I would reasonably advise other consumers not to be too frustrated and simply wait and see.
They should keep their head up. Okay, but talk about this before we wrap up. I mean, you were one of the independent experts that was able to look at that GDP as it was going to pop up. Eventually, it's done. Any competitive advantage for Lagos?
Oh, doubtless. Nigeria has a number of obvious data gaps, and one of those data gaps is at what we call the subnational level, the state levels. Before now, Nigeria doesn't publish officially GDP numbers for states, gross state product as we call them. But the assumption has typically been that, depending on whose numbers you look at, Lagos was either the first or the second largest economy. My own sense is probably, I've seen figures that state Lagos about between 13 and 15% But if you ask the Lagos state government, they will tell you Lagos is 20% of the Nigerian economy. It doesn't matter whichever ones. However, with a rebased GDP of about 5%, and so as a competitive, as a market, it now becomes, before we used to say Lagos was the 5th largest economy as a standalone in Africa. Now it's obvious that it's even more vital to Africa than what we thought until Sunday. So for me, it now shows itself as a more viable market, a bigger opportunity space, and therefore a lot of people who hadn't been interested in looking in this direction will have their attention dragged by the new set of numbers that we have.
Okay. Well, I have to thank you for coming on. Dr. Doyin Salami is an economist with the Lagos Business School. He's here for the Lagos Economy Summit, and we'll catch up with him much later, I imagine, in that summit. Thank you for coming on.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
All right, then. Well, back in just a moment. Please join us again.